At 06:30 on August 17, 1943, Colonel Curtis LeMay stood on the flight line at Royal Air Force Chelveston in England, watching 146 B-17 Flying Fortresses prepare for a mission that would test whether American daylight bombing doctrine was brilliant strategy or catastrophic mistake. The target was Regensburg, Germany, 430 miles into occupied Europe, beyond the range of any fighter escort. The Luftwaffe would have the bombers to themselves for hours. British officers who had watched their own daylight bombing attempts collapse in 1940 knew what was coming. They said nothing. The Americans were about to learn a lesson written in blood. LeMay was 36 years old. He had been commanding the 305th Bomb Group since October 1942. In the past 3 months, the 8th Air Force had lost over 200 heavy bombers over Europe. Most were shot down during daylight raids, when German fighters could see them clearly, could set up perfect intercept angles, could take their time lining up shots. The British had tried daylight bombing in 1939 and 1940. The lessons were written in blood. On December 14, 1939, 24 Wellington bombers attacked German naval vessels near Wilhelmshaven in broad daylight. 12 were shot down. The loss rate of 50% was unsustainable. On December 18th, another daylight raid cost the Royal Air Force 12 of 22 Wellingtons. These disasters forced the Royal Air Force to switch to night operations by mid-1940. Night bombing had its own problems. Navigating to targets in darkness was extraordinarily difficult. Early in the war, British studies showed that only 1 in 3 aircraft claiming to have bombed a target actually dropped within 5 miles of it. Many bombs fell in open countryside. The technology simply did not exist for precision night bombing. The Royal Air Force adapted by switching to area bombing, targeting entire cities rather than specific factories. If you could not hit a factory, you could at least hit the city containing the factory. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris commanded Royal Air Force Bomber Command from February 1942 onward. Harris was a true believer in strategic bombing, but he rejected the American faith in precision. He argued that destroying German cities, killing German workers, and breaking German morale would win the war faster than attempting to hit specific factories. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, and the Ruhr industrial cities were burned night after night. The firestorm attacks killed tens of thousands of German civilians and destroyed vast amounts of housing and infrastructure. The British approach worked in ways the planners had not anticipated. Bombing forced Germany to divert enormous resources to air defense. Over 1 million workers were pulled from frontline production to build shelters, clear rubble, and rebuild destroyed cities. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns that could have supported armies on the Eastern Front were instead tied down defending German cities. The Luftwaffe was forced to keep fighter units in Germany rather than sending them to support operations in Russia or the Mediterranean. British night bombing losses were significantly lower than American daylight losses through most of 1943. Royal Air Force crews faced terrible dangers: flak, night fighters equipped with radar, searchlights. But the darkness provided some protection. Loss rates averaged 3 to 4% per mission for most of the war. Individual raids could be far worse. The attack on Nuremberg on March 30th, 1944 cost 95 bombers from a force of 795 aircraft, a 12% loss rate that shocked Bomber Command. The Americans studied British methods carefully but rejected them. American doctrine demanded precision. The Norden bomb sight, which cost $8,000 per unit in 1943, over $130,000 in today's currency, was supposed to enable unprecedented accuracy. Bombardiers trained for months to use it. The mythology claimed a skilled bombardier could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The reality was far more modest. In actual combat conditions, with clouds, extreme cold, fighter attacks, and evasive maneuvering, only about 1/3 of bombs dropped from high altitude landed within 1,000 feet of the aiming point. Many missed by miles. But this was still far more accurate than night area bombing. The fundamental disagreement came down to philosophy. The British had learned from painful experience that bombers could not survive over Germany in daylight without fighter escort, and no fighter in 1942 had the range to escort bombers deep into Germany. Therefore, bomb at night. The Americans believed their bombers were tough enough, their formations tight enough, their gunners skilled enough to fight through German defenses in daylight. They believed precision targeting was worth the cost. Both sides had evidence supporting their positions, and both sides were partially correct. But the Americans refused to abandon their doctrine despite British warnings. American strategists believed daylight precision bombing was the only way to achieve decisive results. Night bombing meant area bombing, dropping explosives on cities and hoping to hit something important. The Americans believed in surgical strikes that would cut the arteries of German war production with precision rather than blunt force. That doctrine sounded perfect in staff meetings at the Air War Plans Division in Washington. It sounded less perfect when you counted the empty beds in the barracks at English bomber bases. Between June and August 1943, bomber crews had a 25% chance of completing their required 25 mission tour. 3 out of 4 would be killed, captured, or too badly wounded to fly again before finishing. The missions told the same story. German fighters were everywhere. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s came in waves, attacking from the sun, from below, from head-on. They fired from 800 yards out where American gunners could barely reach them, then broke away before the formation could concentrate fire. Once a bomber fell out of formation, it was finished. German pilots called them stragglers and tore them apart. American gunners were brave and well-trained, but gunnery from a bomber is defensive. You cannot maneuver, you cannot chase. You fly straight and level on the bomb run and hope your 50 caliber machine guns keep the fighters far enough away. German pilots learned to attack from angles where only 1 or 2 gunners could engage. They learned to focus on stragglers. They learned to wait until bombers were low on ammunition before pressing final attacks. The Luftwaffe fighter force defending Germany was the most experienced air defense system in the world. They had been perfecting their tactics for 3 years. The 305th Bomb Group, which LeMay had commanded and shaped, would lose 13 aircraft on the second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943, the highest loss of any group on that mission. Between its first combat mission in November 1942 and the end of the war, the group would lose 154 aircraft missing in action. The techniques LeMay pioneered, the combat box formation that concentrated defensive firepower, became standard across the 8th Air Force, but they could not prevent the losses that mounted through 1943. American strategists knew the losses were high. They justified it by claiming precision bombing would shorten the war, would save more lives in the long run by destroying German industrial capacity faster than area bombing at night could achieve. The theory was sound. The problem was that German industry was not being destroyed. Factories were rebuilt. Production lines were dispersed. Ball-bearing plants that were supposedly critical turned out to have redundant capacity. Oil refineries that were hit hard in one raid were back in operation within weeks. Meanwhile, British night bombing was burning German cities to the ground. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, the Ruhr industrial region. The Royal Air Force dropped thousands of tons of incendiaries and high explosives on urban areas every night. It was not precise. It killed civilians. But it destroyed German housing, German transportation, German morale. It forced Germany to pull 1 million workers from the front lines to rebuild cities and clear rubble. Night bombing was working in ways the planners had not anticipated. The fundamental disagreement came down to philosophy. The British had learned from painful experience that bombers could not survive over Germany in daylight without fighter escort, and no fighter had the range to escort bombers deep into Germany. Therefore, bomb at night. The Americans believed their bombers were tough enough, their formations tight enough, their gunners skilled enough to fight through German defenses in daylight. They believed precision targeting was worth the cost. Both sides had evidence. The British pointed to their own daylight bombing casualties from 1939 and 1940. The Luftwaffe had destroyed entire squadrons of Wellingtons and Blenheims. Royal Air Force losses had been unsustainable. Only switching to night operations had saved Bomber Command from being wiped out. The Americans pointed to their B-17 and B-24 bombers, which were more heavily armed and armoured than British aircraft. American formations flew in tight defensive boxes that concentrated firepower. American doctrine emphasized mutual support. In theory, a well-flown formation of heavy bombers could defend itself. In practice, Formations got disrupted by weather, by navigation errors, by aircraft mechanical failures. Once gaps opened in the formation, German fighters exploited them ruthlessly. A single bomber out of position was dead. A flight of 3 bombers separated from the main force was dead. Only the core of the formation, the bombers packed tightly together with overlapping fields of fire, had any chance, and even they took losses. The worst part was the mathematics. Bomber crews understood the statistics. Most would not survive 25 missions. They watched beds empty in the barracks. They attended memorial services. They wrote letters home they hoped would arrive before the telegram. And they got up the next morning, attended briefing, and climbed back into their aircraft because that was the mission. Crew survival depended on skill and luck, weighted heavily toward luck. Pilots who maintained tight formation discipline survived longer than those who did not. But if German fighters happened to attack your section of the formation, if flak happened to burst near your aircraft, skill would not save you. Missions were 10-hour flights at high altitude in unpressurized aircraft, where temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Crews wore electrically heated suits that sometimes shorted out. Frostbite and hypoxia killed as efficiently as cannon shells. The doctrine that sent these men into daylight skies over Germany came from the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama, where in the 1930s a group of strategic bombing theorists had developed the concept of precision daylight bombing. Officers like Harold George, Kenneth Walker, and Haywood Hansel had studied industrial targeting and concluded that modern economies were fragile systems. Cut the right nodes, destroy the right factories, and you could paralyze an enemy nation without invading. Precision bombing could win wars by itself. The theory assumed bombers could reach their targets. The theorists knew fighters would try to stop them. They addressed this by designing bombers with heavy defensive armament. The B-17G model carried 13 50 caliber machine guns, the most heavily armed bomber variant yet produced. The idea was that bombers in formation would create such intense defensive fire that fighters would be unable to press attacks. The theorists believed this would work because it had to work. If bombers could not defend themselves, if fighters could stop bomber raids, then strategic bombing doctrine collapsed. The entire premise of air power independence, of the Air Corps becoming its own branch separate from the Army, depended on bombers being able to reach and destroy targets without fighter escort. This was not just theoretical, it was political. Senior Air Corps officers fighting for independence and funding needed strategic bombing to work. They needed to prove that air power alone could decide wars, that you did not need massive armies and navies if you had enough bombers. Congress would not fund an independent air force to provide tactical support to ground troops. Congress might fund an independent air force that could knock Germany out of the war by destroying its factories. So, the doctrine became sacred. Precision daylight bombing was not just a tactic, it was the foundation of Air Corps identity, the justification for independence, the proof that air power was a decisive weapon. Abandoning daylight bombing meant admitting the British had been right all along, that bombers could not survive over defended territory without fighter escort, that strategic bombing required either night operations or fighter support. Either option undermined the case for Air Force independence. General Henry Arnold commanded the United States Army Air Forces. He believed deeply in strategic bombing. He had pushed for B-17 production, had fought for resources, had built the 8th Air Force specifically to prove that American air power could destroy Germany from the air. Arnold was a true believer. He had to be. If strategic bombing failed, his career and his vision failed with it. Arnold faced a problem. Losses were mounting. In August 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 108 heavy bombers, over 1,000 aircrew killed or missing. Those numbers would only get worse as raids went deeper into Germany, beyond the range of escort fighters. The Luftwaffe was getting stronger, not weaker. German fighter production was increasing. German pilots were gaining experience. The defensive system was becoming more lethal. Arnold knew Churchill, and the British air staff were watching. Churchill had been skeptical of American daylight bombing from the start. He had offered the Americans bases in England and had provided support, but he had made it clear he thought daylight operations were doomed to fail, just as British daylight operations had failed. Churchill was waiting for the Americans to admit defeat and switch to night bombing under Royal Air Force control. The confrontation came at the Casablanca Conference in mid-January 1943. Churchill, Roosevelt, and their military staffs met in Morocco from January 14 through January 24 to plan Allied strategy. One topic was strategic bombing. Churchill argued forcefully that the Americans should abandon daylight operations and join the Royal Air Force in night bombing. He presented statistics on British losses from 1939 and 1940. He showed that night bombing had reduced casualties dramatically. He argued that combined Allied bomber forces attacking at night could overwhelm German defences and destroy German cities faster than separate operations. Churchill was persuasive. He was also right about the casualty numbers. British night bombing losses were running at about 3 to 4% per mission. American daylight losses were running at 6 to 8% per mission, and on some deep penetration raids, losses hit 15%. The mathematics were brutal. At 15% losses, a bomber group would be wiped out in 7 missions. At 6%, crews had maybe a 50-50 chance of surviving 25 missions. At 3%, most crews would complete their tours. Roosevelt listened. So did General Arnold. The pressure to switch to night bombing was immense. The British had years of experience. The numbers supported their case. American bomber crews were dying at rates that would deplete the 8th Air Force within months if losses continued. Switching to night operations would save American lives, would increase the tonnage of bombs dropped on Germany, would allow combined planning and operations. Arnold knew all of this. He also knew that switching to night bombing would end. The doctrine of precision daylight bombing would validate British methods, would undermine the case for Air Force independence. He needed someone to make the case for continuing daylight operations. He needed arguments that could convince Roosevelt and counter Churchill. He sent for Brigadier General Ira Eaker. Eaker commanded the 8th Air Force bomber operations in England. He had been flying combat missions himself to understand what his crews faced. Eaker was 47 years old, a pilot since 1918, a true believer in strategic bombing. Arnold gave him 24 hours to prepare arguments for keeping daylight bombing. Eaker's presentation at Casablanca would determine the future of American air strategy. Eaker worked through the night of January 19, 1943, preparing his arguments. He knew the odds were against him. Churchill was one of the greatest orators of the 20th century, a master of persuasion. The British case was built on hard evidence, actual combat experience, undeniable casualty statistics. American losses in recent months had been horrific, but Eaker believed daylight precision bombing could work if given time, resources, and most critically, long-range fighter escorts that were already in development. Eaker prepared a one-page memorandum. He understood that neither Roosevelt nor Churchill would sit through lengthy technical presentations. He needed arguments that were clear, compelling, and addressed Churchill's concerns directly. The document he created would become one of the most important pieces of paper in air power history, determining the course of the bombing campaign and potentially affecting the outcome of the war. His first argument addressed the practical realities of switching strategies. American crews were trained for daylight bombing. Their aircraft were designed for daylight bombing. The Norden bomb site only worked in daylight. Converting to British night bombing methods would require retraining thousands of pilots, bombardiers, and navigators. It would require months of preparation. During that transition period, the bombing of Germany would nearly cease. Every month of delay gave German industry time to produce more fighters, more tanks, more submarines. The war would last longer. More Allied soldiers would die. Switching to night operations was not a simple matter of changing tactics. It would paralyze American bombing efforts for the better part of a year. His second argument was strategic and elegant in its simplicity. If Americans bombed by day and British bombed by night, Germany would face attack around the clock. German workers would spend half their time in shelters instead of factories. German fighters would have to defend day and night, exhausting pilots and spreading defenses thin. German anti-aircraft crews would get no rest. The combined pressure of continuous bombardment would break German industrial capacity faster than night raids alone could achieve. This argument particularly appealed to Churchill, who appreciated military strategies that stretched enemy resources. His third argument addressed the core issue of survivability. American bombers were more heavily armed and armored than British bombers. The B-17 and B-24 carried more guns and could take more damage than Wellingtons or Lancasters. American combat box formations concentrated defensive firepower in ways the British had never attempted. With proper tactics, sufficient numbers, and tight formation discipline, American bombers could survive daylight operations long enough for the next critical development. That development was long-range escort fighters. Eaker revealed that both American and British engineers were working on drop tank technology that would extend fighter range. New fighter designs were in development and testing. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with a British Merlin engine, showed exceptional promise. Within 6 to 12 months, possibly sooner, escort fighters would be able to accompany bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back. At that point, daylight bombing would become far more survivable. German fighters would have to fight through American fighters to reach the bombers. The balance would shift decisively. Eaker's final argument concerned precision versus area bombing. He acknowledged that Royal Air Force night bombing destroyed German cities and killed German workers, but only precision daylight bombing could destroy the specific industrial nodes that were true bottlenecks in German war production: ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, synthetic oil refineries. These critical targets required daylight accuracy. Night bombing could burn residential areas. Daylight bombing could eliminate the factories themselves. Both methods were necessary. Britain would attack the cities and the workers. America would attack the factories and the machines. Together, Allied bombers would destroy Germany's capacity to make war faster than either approach alone could achieve. The memorandum was elegant, logical, and addressed every one of Churchill's objections. Eaker delivered it personally to Churchill on the morning of January 20th. Churchill read it carefully, then summoned Eaker to a private meeting that lasted over 2 hours. Churchill questioned every assumption, challenged every statistic, probed every claim. He pointed out that German fighters were currently shooting down American bombers faster than American factories could replace them. He noted that German industry was dispersing, moving underground, adapting to bombing. He reminded Eaker that Britain had tried daylight bombing and failed catastrophically. Why would American results be any different? Eaker argued that American bombers were fundamentally different aircraft. The B-17 was designed from the beginning for high-altitude daylight operations. British bombers in 1939 lacked comparable defensive armament or armor protection. American formations were more sophisticated. American training was more intensive. Most importantly, American bombers only needed to survive until long-range escorts arrived. That was a matter of months, not years. Britain had abandoned daylight bombing too quickly, before developing the tactics and technology that would make it viable. America was asking for 1 year to prove the concept. If daylight bombing failed after a year with proper fighter support, then the discussion could be revisited. His first argument was practical. American crews were trained for daylight bombing. Switching to night operations would require retraining thousands of pilots, bombardiers, and navigators. The Norden bomb site was designed for daylight use. Converting to British night bombing methods would take months and would reduce bombing effectiveness during the transition. Time mattered. Every month, Germany remained unbombed, gave German industry time to produce more tanks, more fighters, more submarines. His second argument was strategic. If Americans bombed by day and British bombed by night, Germany would be under attack around the clock. This would force German workers into shelters constantly, would disrupt production more than attacks concentrated in night hours only. Combined operations would stretch German defences, would wear down the Luftwaffe, would give Germany no respite. His third argument was tactical. American bombers were designed for daylight operations. They were more heavily armed and armoured than British bombers. American formations provided mutual defensive fire. With proper tactics and sufficient numbers, American bombers could survive daylight operations until long-range escort fighters became available. British scientists were working on drop tanks that would extend fighter range. American aircraft manufacturers were developing new fighter designs. The P-51 Mustang was in testing. In 6 to 12 months, Escort fighters would be able to accompany bombers all the way to targets in Germany. At that point, daylight bombing would become far more survivable. Eaker's fourth argument was about precision. He acknowledged that night bombing destroyed German cities, but he argued that daylight bombing destroyed specific industrial targets, ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries. These were the nodes that would cripple German war production. Night bombing could burn housing and kill workers, but only precision daylight bombing could destroy the factories themselves. Both methods were necessary. Britain would attack the cities, America would attack the factories. Together they would destroy Germany's ability to make war. The memo was 283 words. Eaker hand delivered it to Churchill on the morning of January 20th. Churchill read it. Then he called Eaker into a private meeting. For 2 hours, Churchill questioned every assumption, every statistic, every claim. He pointed out that German fighters were shooting down American bombers faster than America could replace them. He noted that German industry was dispersing, that factories were being moved underground, that precision bombing was hitting targets that could be rebuilt. He reminded Eaker that Britain had tried daylight bombing and failed. Why would American results be different? Eaker argued that American bombers were tougher, that American formations were better organized, that American bombing accuracy was superior. He conceded that current losses were high but insisted they would decrease as tactics improved and escort fighters arrived. He acknowledged British experience, but pointed out that British bombers in 1939 lacked the defensive armament of American B-17s. He promised that if given 1 year, the 8th Air Force would prove daylight precision bombing could work. Churchill was not convinced, but he was impressed by Eaker's conviction. More importantly, Churchill understood political realities. Roosevelt supported daylight bombing. American public opinion expected American bombers to fight in daylight, to prove American methods were superior to British methods. Forcing Americans to adopt British tactics would create friction in the alliance. Churchill valued Allied unity more than tactical doctrine. If the Americans wanted to bomb by day and accept higher casualties, that was their choice. Churchill agreed to support continued American daylight operations. He secured Roosevelt's commitment to around-the-clock bombing, the combined bomber offensive. Americans would bomb by day, British would bomb by night. Both air forces would coordinate targets and timing to maximize pressure on Germany. The agreement was formalized in the Casablanca Directive issued February 4, 1943. Eaker had won the argument. Now he had to prove daylight bombing could succeed. The next 6 months would determine whether his promises were realistic or whether Churchill had been right all along. The first test came on August 17, 1943. The target was the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. This was exactly the kind of mission Eaker had promised. Deep penetration strikes against critical industrial targets. Regensburg produced roughly 1/3 of Germany's Messerschmitt 109 fighters. Schweinfurt produced over half of Germany's ball bearings. Destroying both would cripple German fighter production and affect every tank, truck, and aircraft Germany built. The plan was ambitious. 146 B-17s would hit Regensburg, then fly on to North Africa instead of returning to England. This would confuse German defences and allow the bombers to attack targets in southern Germany on the way. 230 B-17s would hit Schweinfurt, absorbing German fighters and allowing the Regensburg force to escape. The raids would be staggered by hours to split German defensive response. Weather delayed the Schweinfurt force. The raids were no longer staggered. Both forces flew into the same German fighter defense system within an hour of each other. The Luftwaffe had time to refuel and rearm between attacks. German fighters hit the bombers in waves all the way from the Belgian coast to the targets and back. The fighting lasted for hours. 60 B-17s were shot down. 600 men killed, captured, or missing. Dozens more bombers were so badly damaged they never flew again. The loss rate was over 18%. At that rate, a crew would last 6 missions on average. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt raids were the bloodiest day in 8th Air Force history up to that point, but the targets were hit. Regensburg's factory was heavily damaged. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production dropped by 34%. Intelligence analysts calculated the raids had set back German fighter production by months and would affect German armaments production for the rest of the year. The cost was terrible, but the results seemed to justify Eaker's promises. Daylight precision bombing could destroy specific German industries if bomber forces were willing to accept the casualties. The Luftwaffe learned from the August engagement and adapted quickly. German fighter commanders realized that American formations were most vulnerable during the hours they flew without fighter escort. The solution was to concentrate overwhelming force against the bombers during that window. Pull fighters from France, from Norway, from training schools, from defensive sectors across occupied Europe, assemble them into large formations, sometimes exceeding 100 aircraft. Attack in coordinated waves. The first wave disrupts the bomber formation. The second wave targets stragglers. The third wave finishes off damaged bombers attempting to escape. German pilots were ordered to accept combat with American escort fighters if necessary, but the primary mission was destroying bombers. Trading fighters for heavy bombers favored Germany. Fighters were cheaper and faster to build. Fighter pilots required less training than 10-man bomber crews. The mathematics of attrition favored the defenders. Colonel Heinz Baer was among the Luftwaffe's most accomplished fighter pilots, with over 200 confirmed aerial victories. He had been fighting Allied aircraft since 1940 and had developed extensive experience attacking bomber formations. Baer pioneered head-on attack tactics against American heavy bombers. The approach was dangerous but effective. German fighters would attack from 12 o'clock high, diving toward the bombers at combined closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. At 800 yards range, well beyond the effective reach of the bombers' 50 caliber defensive guns, German pilots opened fire with 20mm cannons and 30mm guns. Then they dove beneath the formation before defensive fire could track them effectively. Head-on attacks were particularly deadly because they targeted the cockpit where pilots sat. The B-17's heaviest armor protected the aircraft from below and from the rear. The nose was more vulnerable. A well-aimed burst of cannon fire into the cockpit could kill both pilots instantly, dooming the aircraft even if the engines and structure remained intact. German pilots became expert at this technique. Some Luftwaffe units claimed that over half their bomber kills resulted from head-on attacks. American bomber crews dreaded seeing the small dots of fighters assembling ahead of them, knowing what was coming. Colonel Heinz Baer was one of the Luftwaffe's top aces with over 200 victories. He had been fighting Allied bombers since 1940. He developed tactics specifically for attacking B-17 formations. Baer's method was to attack head-on at high speed, fire from 800 yards, then break away before the bomber's guns could track him. Head-on attacks reduced the bomber's defensive fire and targeted the cockpit where pilots sat. If you killed the pilot, the bomber was finished, even if the aircraft itself was still flyable. Baer shot down 4 B-17s during the Schweinfurt raid. 2 were head-on kills where his cannon fire killed the pilots. 1 was a bomber that fell out of formation after taking engine damage. The 4th was a straggler limping home on 3 engines. Baer emptied his ammunition into it and watched it go down in flames over France. He returned to base, rearmed, refueled, and went back up. He found more bombers returning from the target and shot at 2 more before his fuel ran low. German pilots like Baer were professionals. They respected American bomber crews for their courage, but respect did not mean mercy. This was war. The bombers were coming to destroy German cities and factories. Shooting them down was not personal. It was duty. Baer later said that American bomber crews were brave men facing a job that required more courage than he possessed. He was a fighter pilot, maneuverable, fast, able to escape when things went wrong. Bomber crews flew straight and level into anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks, with no way to evade, no way to hide. Baer said it took a special kind of courage to do that mission after mission, knowing the odds. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe had developed a coordinated defense system. Radar stations along the coast detected incoming bomber formations and provided early warning. Fighter controllers vectored interceptors to optimal positions. Fighters assembled into large formations, sometimes over 100 aircraft, and attacked in waves. The first wave would disrupt the bomber formation. The second wave would target stragglers. The third wave would finish off damaged bombers trying to escape. The system was efficient and lethal. American losses reflected the German improvements. In September, the 8th Air Force lost 105 heavy bombers. In October, the numbers got worse. On October 8th, a raid on Bremen cost 30 bombers. On October 10th, a raid on Munster cost 30 more. Then came Black Thursday, October 14th, 1943. The target was Schweinfurt again. Intelligence said the ball-bearing factories had recovered from the August raid and were back to full production. Destroying them would cripple German armaments. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s. German fighters were waiting. The bombers were hit by over 300 German fighters flying in coordinated waves. The attacks began over Belgium and continued without pause all the way to Schweinfurt and back. American gunners shot down German fighters, but more kept coming. Bomber formations were shredded. Aircraft fell out of the sky, trailing smoke and fire. Parachutes blossomed as crews bailed out. Some bombers blew up when fire reached their bomb bays. Others simply broke apart under repeated cannon fire. 60 B-17s were shot down. 17 more crashed on landing or were damaged so badly they never flew again. Over 650 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The loss rate was over 20%. 5 bomb groups lost more than 30% of their aircraft. The 100th Bomb Group, already suffering heavy casualties, lost 12 of 21 aircraft dispatched. The 305th Bomb Group lost 13 aircraft, the highest loss of any group on the mission. Schweinfurt was hit again. Ball-bearing production dropped significantly after the August raid by approximately 34%. However, the October raid resulted in only modest additional production, disruption of roughly 10%, as the Germans had already begun dispersing manufacturing. Intelligence had underestimated German ball-bearing reserves and alternative supply sources from Sweden and Switzerland, but the immediate cost was unbearable. At over 20% losses per mission, crews would last only a few missions on average. The 8th Air Force could not sustain those casualty rates. Bomber production could replace lost aircraft, but training replacement crews took months. The Luftwaffe was winning the battle of attrition. After Black Thursday, deep penetration raids were suspended. The 8th Air Force continued bombing targets within escort fighter range, but the heart of German industry, the targets that really mattered, were off-limits until a solution could be found. That solution was long-range escort fighters, but in October 1943, no fighter had the range to escort bombers deep into Germany and back. The P-38 Lightning had range, but performed poorly at high altitude where bombers flew. The P-47 Thunderbolt was an excellent fighter, but had limited range even with drop tanks. The British Spitfire had even less range. The P-51 Mustang was still in testing and was not yet available in numbers. Until long-range escorts arrived, American bombers could not reach most of Germany without prohibitive losses. Critics argued this proved the British had been right all along. Daylight bombing without fighter escort was suicide. The Americans should admit failure and switch to night operations. Some American officers agreed. The casualty numbers were undeniable. Bomber crews were being slaughtered. Continuing daylight raids seemed like sending men to die to protect a failed doctrine. But others argued the strategy was working despite the losses. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production was crippled. Regensburg's fighter output was reduced. German industry was being forced to disperse, to move underground, to divert resources to air defense. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns were tied down, defending German cities instead of supporting armies at the front. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots. German fighter production was increasing, but so were German fighter losses. The attrition was mutual. The question was whether Germany or America would break first. Arnold decided to continue. He authorized production of additional drop tanks for P-47 Thunderbolts, extending their escort range. He pushed for accelerated delivery of P-51 Mustangs. He ordered P-38 Lightning groups to develop high-altitude tactics. He approved bombing missions within escort range while the long-range fighter problem was solved. And he replaced Ira Eaker as 8th Air Force commander. Eaker had done everything asked of him. He had built the 8th Air Force from nothing. He had developed tactics. He had led from the front, flying missions himself. But the losses had occurred on his watch. and Arnold needed a change for political reasons. In January 1944, Eaker was transferred to command Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. Major General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle brought a different philosophy. Eaker had ordered escort fighters to stay with the bombers, to protect them. Doolittle ordered fighters to hunt down German fighters aggressively, shoot down the Luftwaffe, do not wait for them to attack the bombers, find them, engage them, destroy them. Turn escort missions into fighter sweeps, make the Germans afraid to take off. The new tactics coincided with the arrival of long-range P-51 Mustangs in numbers. By March 1944, Mustang groups were escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. German fighters that tried to attack bomber formations faced Mustangs that were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots eager to engage. The balance shifted. German fighter losses soared. In February 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 33% of its fighter pilots killed or wounded. In March, the losses were even worse. Experienced pilots were dying. Replacements had less training, less experience. The quality of the Luftwaffe fighter force was declining rapidly. By May 1944, American fighters were shooting down German fighters at 4-to-1 ratios. The Luftwaffe still had aircraft, but it was running out of pilots who could use them effectively. American bomber losses dropped. In May 1944, loss rates fell below 3% per mission. Bomber crews who had watched friends die all through 1943 suddenly had a realistic chance of surviving their tours. The difference was obvious. Missions with Mustang escort came back with minimal losses. The long-range escort fighters that Eaker had promised at Casablanca, that had seemed like wishful thinking in the dark days of 1943, were now reality. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force had air superiority over most of Western Europe. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, but was unable to stop Allied bombing. German fighter production was actually increasing, reaching peak output in September 1944, but pilot training was inadequate and fuel was scarce. Germany built fighters it could not operate effectively. The strategic bombing campaign, both day and night, was working. The combined bomber offensive dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on German-controlled territory between 1943 and 1945. American daylight bombing destroyed specific industrial targets. British night bombing destroyed German cities and infrastructure. Together they devastated German war production and civilian morale. Strategic bombing reduced German armaments production significantly. Precision targeting of oil facilities in late 1944 crippled German mobility. By early 1945, German tanks and aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel. The cost was staggering. The 8th Air Force lost over 5,800 heavy bombers and over 26,000 men killed in action during the war. Royal Air Force Bomber Command lost over 8,000 aircraft and 55,000 aircrew killed. These casualties exceeded those of many ground combat units. The question of whether strategic bombing justified its cost remains debated by historians. Ira Eaker never received full credit for his role in preserving daylight bombing. He was transferred to Mediterranean Command in January 1944, just as the strategy began working. After the war, he retired as a lieutenant general and worked in civilian industry. When asked about Casablanca, he said simply that he believed precision bombing could work and that events proved him right. The cost in lives haunted him, but he believed the strategy shortened the war. Curtis LeMay survived the war and later commanded Strategic Air Command during the Cold War. His experience over Germany in 1943 shaped his view that wars should be fought with overwhelming force. Critics called him ruthless. Supporters called him effective. LeMay said that if you fight a war, fight to win. James Doolittle became a 4-star general and remained influential in military aviation after the war. He defended daylight precision bombing against critics, arguing that destroying specific targets was more efficient than area bombing and that with proper fighter escort, daylight operations were sustainable. He acknowledged the losses but pointed to the results. Germany's industrial base destroyed, the Luftwaffe defeated, the war shortened. Henry Arnold achieved his goal. The United States Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force in 1947, independent of the Army. Strategic bombing doctrine was vindicated. The Air Force became the guardian of America's nuclear deterrent. Arnold died in 1950, having seen his vision realized. The bomber crews who flew the missions received little public recognition beyond their medals. Most went home, resumed civilian lives, and rarely spoke about the war. They attended reunions, kept in touch with crewmates, and honored the memory of those who did not return. The memorial at Cambridge American Cemetery in England lists the names of over 5,000 American airmen killed over Europe, with no known graves. Most were bomber crew members shot down over Germany, their aircraft falling into forests or fields or crashing into the sea. Their families received telegrams saying, "Missing in action, presumed dead." Some bodies were eventually found and identified. Most were never recovered. That memorial stands as testament to the cost of proving daylight bombing could work. The men who flew into German skies, mission after mission, knowing the statistics, doing it anyway because the mission required it. The crews who climbed into their aircraft while empty beds multiplied in the barracks, the bomber pilots who held formation through fighter attacks and flak bursts, the gunners who fired until their ammunition ran out. These men proved that daylight precision bombing could work, but only at tremendous cost, and only with fighter escort. They proved that American doctrine was not wrong, just incomplete. The strategy succeeded because thousands of young men were willing to fly missions with survival odds that made the entire concept nearly unthinkable. The debate between American and British bombing doctrine was ultimately about more than tactics. It was about national identity, about proving American methods could succeed, about justifying air power independence. The cost of proving that point was measured in thousands of lives. If you found this story valuable, please support this channel by clicking like. Subscribe to stay connected with these stories that honor those who served. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community reaches across America and around the world. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring these sacrifices are never forgotten.